believe this is happening.
Who is that man in the picture?
This is awful.
I thought my family had already done the worst thing possible when they humiliated me on my wedding day, but I was wrong. Because 2 days later, a voicemail led me to a hidden recording. That recording led me to forged documents with my name on them, and those documents led me back to the night my father died. By the time I recognized the man my mother had paid to stay silent, I realized my wedding was never the real attack. It was a distraction. And the truth they were hiding was so much darker than I ever imagined. I listened to the voicemail 3 times before I could breathe normally again. The first time, all I heard was the tension in the voice and the warning at the end. The second time, I noticed the hesitation, like the person leaving it was scared even now. By the third time, I understood the part that made my skin go cold. They had not called to comfort me. They had not called because they felt guilty. They had called because whatever they recorded at my wedding was dangerous enough to make them afraid. I sat at the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand and stared at the wall while my husband watched me from across the room. He did not rush me. He had learned that silence could either wound or protect, and this time his silence felt like protection, the kind that gives pain room to arrive honestly. I could feel that old instinct rising in me again, the one that wanted to minimize everything, to tell myself it was probably nothing, that I was overreacting, that no new disaster was waiting for me around the corner. But my body knew better. My body had started recognizing danger long before my mind ever caught up. The voicemail had come from someone who was at the wedding but had kept to the edges of the room, someone quiet, someone forgettable on purpose. I barely remembered seeing them near the hallway outside the reception room, standing half in shadow with a drink they never seemed to finish. At the time, I thought they were just another distant relative or guest from my mother's side, one more face blending into a crowd that never really felt like it belonged to me. Now I could not stop seeing them, not because of what they had said, but because of what they had implied. They had recorded everything before the slideshow started. The arguments, the planning, the certainty in my mother's voice. The laughter. The laughter was what stayed with me. Humiliation I understood. My family had humiliated me in private for years. What I had never fully accepted was how much joy they took in it. There is something uniquely shattering about realizing your pain was not just convenient for someone else. It was entertaining. That thought sat in my chest like broken glass. It turned every old memory sharper. Every family dinner. Every backhanded compliment. Every story they told about me in front of other people that made everyone laugh while I sat there pretending not to mind. The wedding had not been a new cruelty. It had been the polished, public version of something they had been rehearsing my entire life. My husband asked me once, very softly, whether I wanted him to call the number back. I nodded, but even then I felt sick. I was not afraid of hearing bad news anymore. I was afraid of hearing proof. Because proof changes things. Proof takes surviving and turns it into reckoning. Proof means you can no longer hide inside doubt. The call did not connect the first time. Or the second. When the phone finally rang through later that evening, I had to press my nails into my palm to stop my hand from shaking. The person on the other end sounded different from the voicemail. Less controlled. More tired. They told me they had been trying to decide whether to contact me at all. They said that after the wedding, they panicked. They thought my family would figure out what they had overheard. They thought staying silent would be safer. But then they saw the way my mother began rewriting the story online, reaching out to relatives, calling me unstable, dramatic, vindictive, claiming my husband had been manipulated by me into turning against the family. The same pattern, just with new victims and better timing. That was when they realized silence was not neutral. It was help. I did not interrupt. I could not. I had the strange sensation of standing on the edge of something steep, knowing the ground beneath me was about to disappear. They told me there was a video file. Not a perfect one. Not enough to capture every face clearly all the time. But enough. Enough audio. Enough voices. Enough detail to prove that the slideshow was only part of the plan. I remember closing my eyes when they said that. Only part. Those 2 words moved through me slowly, heavily. Like a door opening somewhere deep in a house, I had spent years pretending was empty. They sent the file that night. I almost could not press play. The video began in a dim hallway outside the reception room. At first, the camera was unsteady, angled too low, as if the person holding it had not meant to start recording yet. Shoes moved across polished floor. Music from the reception drifted faintly through the walls. Then the voices started, and I knew them instantly. My mother, my sister, my aunt, one of my cousins. Their tones were relaxed, amused, focused in the way people sound when they are discussing logistics for something they have already decided is justified. I heard my mother ask whether the final slides had been added. I heard my sister say the last one would destroy me if the earlier ones did not. I heard someone mention that once the room started doubting me, everything else would be easy. Then came the sentence that made the air leave my lungs. My mother said that if humiliation did not split my marriage open immediately, the documents would. She said my husband looked loyal, but men like him always stepped back once they realized they had married into instability. She said all they needed was one night to make him question who I really was. I stopped the recording and threw up. There are truths that hurt because they are cruel. And there are truths that hurt because they confirm the ugliest thing you have always feared. My whole life, I had been told in ways both subtle and obvious that I was difficult to love. Too emotional, too complicated, too damaged. Hearing my mother weaponize that fear so casually, so confidently, brought back every version of me that had ever begged for acceptance. The little girl who apologized for crying. The teenager who learned to stay quiet. The woman who still thought maybe her wedding could soften them. I grieved for all of her at once. My husband found me sitting on the bathroom floor afterward, my face wet, my body trembling with exhaustion more than panic. He knelt in front of me and held my hands until I looked at him. There was anger in his expression now, but not the wild kind. It was colder than that. Cleaner. The kind of anger that has already decided what comes next. We listened to the rest together. What came after was worse. Buried between the jokes and planning was another name. Not mine. A man's name. Repeated twice. Quietly. Carefully. At first I thought it was one of the lawyers involved in the inheritance documents, but then my aunt said something that made my entire body go still. She said he had already been paid once, and would be paid again if he kept his mouth shut. My sister laughed and said he was never going to talk because he had too much to lose. Then my mother said the part that changed everything. She said that if anyone ever traced what happened to my father's shares, it would all come down on him first. My father had been dead for 6 years. Until that moment, I had believed the wedding was about control, money, and reputation. I had believed they wanted to discredit me, so I would stay weak and dependent. But hearing my father brought into it, hearing his name spoken like a problem they still had to manage, made something darker take shape. This was bigger than inheritance, bigger than humiliation. There was something they had buried long before my wedding, and for some reason, they were terrified that my marriage might expose it. I stared at the paused screen with my pulse hammering in my throat. My husband leaned closer, replayed the line, and we listened again in silence. That was when I understood the voicemail had never really been a warning. It was evidence, and whatever my family had done, it started before the wedding, before the inheritance, maybe even before my father died. The moment my father's name surfaced in that recording, the entire story I thought I understood began to shift under my feet. For years, his death had existed in my mind as a closed chapter. Painful, yes. Complicated in the quiet ways families sometimes are, but finished. Something that belonged to the past. Hearing my mother speak about his shares like a loose thread they still needed to control shattered that illusion instantly. I sat in the living room long after the video ended, my phone resting on the table in front of me like it had become something dangerous. My husband was beside me, his presence steady and calm, but my thoughts were already moving backward through time. Every memory of my father suddenly felt heavier. Not because they had changed, but because I realized I had never questioned the circumstances surrounding his death the way I should have. At the time, everything had moved too quickly for questions. My father collapsed unexpectedly at home one evening. The official explanation was simple: heart failure. The doctors said it was sudden but not impossible. Stress, genetics, long hours running the business. My mother repeated those explanations so calmly that no one thought to challenge them. The funeral was arranged quickly. The legal paperwork was handled even faster. I was grieving too deeply to notice how organized everyone else seemed. Looking back now, that efficiency no longer felt comforting. It felt calculated. The recording replayed in my mind again and again. My aunt's voice mentioning a man who had already been paid once. My sister's casual laughter about him never talking. My mother's cold certainty that if anyone traced the issue with my father's shares, the blame would fall on him first. Those words carried a kind of quiet confidence that only comes from believing a secret is safe. But secrets only stay safe as long as no one starts looking for them. That night, my husband asked a question that seemed simple on the surface but completely rearranged the way I thought about everything. He asked who handled the paperwork after my father died. At first, I assumed it had been a standard legal process. My mother had always said the family lawyer oversaw everything, that the business assets were divided the way my father intended. But when I actually tried to remember the details, my mind came up strangely blank. I had never seen the documents myself. At the time, I was barely holding myself together emotionally. My father had been the only person in the family who treated me with uncomplicated kindness. Losing him had felt like losing the one safe place I had left. When my mother told me she would take care of the legal matters so I could focus on grieving, I had accepted that without hesitation. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Now, sitting there years later with that recording echoing in my ears, I felt a creeping realization begin to take shape. Trust had made me passive in moments when I should have been paying attention. The next morning, I started searching. The first place I looked was the business itself. My father had built it slowly over decades, turning what began as a small logistics operation into something quietly profitable. He used to joke that the company was boring on the surface but powerful underneath. Reliable contracts, stable partnerships. The kind of business that didn't make headlines but generated steady wealth. After he died, my mother told everyone she had stepped in to stabilize things. According to her version of events, the transition had been smooth because my father had prepared for it carefully. That explanation had always sounded reasonable, but reasonable stories can hide a lot of missing details. I requested the company records from the public registry first. It took several hours of searching before the first strange piece of information appeared. Ownership percentages had changed shortly after my father's death. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. My mother's share increased slightly. My aunt acquired a portion as well. And mine had decreased. At first, I assumed I was reading the records incorrectly. I opened the files again, slower this time, comparing the dates carefully. The change happened only 3 weeks after my father's funeral. According to the documents, I had signed an agreement transferring part of my ownership to the family trust. But there was one obvious problem with that claim. I had never signed anything. My hands went cold as I stared at the digital signature attached to the document. My name was there. My initials were placed exactly where they should have been. To anyone who didn't know me personally, it would look legitimate. But I knew the shape of my own handwriting better than anyone. That signature wasn't mine. A quiet shock settled into my chest, heavy and undeniable. I scrolled through the rest of the files with growing disbelief. The agreement claimed I had voluntarily transferred control of certain shares to the trust for financial stability and long-term management. It framed the decision as responsible and cooperative, the kind of move a daughter might make to support the family during a difficult transition. Except I had no memory of that conversation, no memory of that decision, no memory of signing away something my father had spent his life building. My husband leaned over my shoulder as I showed him the document. He didn't react immediately, but I could feel the tension in his posture. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but sharper than usual. He asked if there was any chance I had signed it without realizing what it was. I tried to imagine that possibility. Grief can make people careless, confused, vulnerable to suggestion. But the more I thought about it, the less believable it felt. Even during the worst days after my father died, I would have remembered signing something related to his business. He had talked about that company constantly when I was growing up. He used to tell me that understanding it would protect me someday. The idea that I would casually give away part of it didn't make sense, which meant the alternative was far worse. Someone had forged my name. I felt a strange mixture of anger and clarity settle over me as the realization took hold. The humiliation at my wedding suddenly looked different through this new lens. My family hadn't just been trying to embarrass me. They were protecting something much older and much more serious. If I ever gained control of the shares my father intended for me, I would also gain access to the company's internal records. And those records might reveal exactly what happened in the weeks surrounding his death. The thought made my heart pound with a kind of cold determination I had never felt before. For the first time since the wedding, my fear began transforming into something else. Something sharper. Something focused. But the recording still held one more detail that refused to leave my mind. The man my family mentioned. The one who had been paid once already. If he had been involved with the share transfer or worse, with my father's death, then he was the missing piece connecting everything. The problem was, I had no idea who he was. Or at least, that's what I believed until later that night. While reviewing the recording again, my husband paused the video at a moment I had overlooked earlier. In the background of the hallway footage, just beyond my aunt's shoulder, someone walked past the camera for less than a second. The image was blurry, barely visible, but there was something familiar about the shape of his face. We zoomed in as much as the footage allowed, and suddenly I recognized him. Not from the wedding, from my father's funeral. He had been standing near the back of the service that day, speaking quietly with my mother before the ceremony began. At the time, I assumed he was one of my father's business partners, someone paying respects. But now, seeing his face again in the wedding recording, a terrible possibility formed in my mind. If he had been present the day my father died, and he had been paid to stay silent, then the secret my family had been protecting wasn't just financial. It might be something far darker. The moment I recognized the man in the blurred frame, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't the kind of calm that comes from comfort. It was the calm that appears when your mind finally connects pieces that have been scattered for years. I had spent so long believing my family's version of events that I never considered how many strangers had quietly moved through the background of our lives. But once I saw his face again, I couldn't unsee it. The funeral memory returned slowly at first, then with uncomfortable clarity. He had been standing near the back of the room, speaking to my mother while everyone else focused on the ceremony. I remembered how serious their conversation looked. Not grieving. Not emotional. Focused. Like two people discussing logistics instead of loss. At the time, I was too numb to question it. Now, that memory felt like evidence. My husband replayed the wedding recording several times, pausing on the frame where the man passed behind my aunt in the hallway. Even with the poor quality, the resemblance was unmistakable. Same build, same sharp jawline, same habit of keeping his head slightly down when he moved, like someone used to staying unnoticed. Whoever he was, he had been present on two of the most important days of my life. My father's funeral, and my wedding. That wasn't coincidence. We started searching immediately. My father's business records listed dozens of names over the years. Contractors, legal consultants, financial advisors. It took hours of cross-checking before one name finally caught my husband's attention. A consultant who had worked with the company briefly during the final year of my father's life. His name appeared only twice in the files, but the timing was impossible to ignore. He had been hired 3 months before my father died, and the contract ended exactly 1 week after the funeral. That detail alone was enough to make my stomach twist. When we searched further, the pattern grew stranger. The man wasn't listed as a long-term employee or partner. His title was vague, something intentionally broad that could cover almost any kind of involvement. Risk management advisor. It sounded official, but it didn't explain why he would be whispering with my mother during a funeral. It didn't explain why my aunt mentioned paying him. And it definitely didn't explain why he had shown up again at my wedding years later. I felt the same sensation I had experienced while listening to the recording. That feeling of standing on the edge of a truth that had been buried carefully and deeply. The more we looked, the more obvious it became that my family had been managing something quietly for a long time. But the most unsettling discovery came when my husband searched the consultant's public records. The man had disappeared. Not dramatically, not in a way that would raise alarms, but his professional history simply stopped. No new contracts, no public listings, no updated contact information. It was as if he had stepped out of the business world completely after finishing his work with my father's company. Or after being paid to stay quiet. I stared at the screen, trying to imagine what kind of secret would require that level of silence. My father had always been careful, organized, deliberate in every business decision he made. The idea that someone like him could be connected to something dangerous enough to erase people from records felt impossible. But the recording existed. The forged signature existed. The altered shares existed. And now this man existed somewhere in the shadows between all of it. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something that looked less like fear and more like purpose. My family had spent years shaping a story about me. A story where I was unstable, irresponsible, emotional. The kind of person no one would trust if she started asking difficult questions. But they had made one mistake. They pushed me too far. If the humiliation at my wedding had never happened, I might have continued living quietly inside their version of reality. I might have accepted their control over the business and over my father's legacy. I might have spent the rest of my life believing the things they said about me. Instead, they exposed themselves. The wedding that was meant to destroy my credibility had become the moment everything began unraveling. My husband understood that before I even said it out loud. He didn't try to slow me down or convince me to let it go. He simply asked what I wanted to do next. For the first time in my life, the answer came without hesitation. I wanted the truth. Not the careful explanations my family had always given. Not the polite version of events that kept everything quiet. The real truth. That meant finding the man from the recording. And if he had been paid to stay silent, then someone out there knew exactly why. The next morning, we contacted our lawyer again and shared everything. The recording, the forged documents, the business records, the consultant's name. He listened carefully without interrupting, which somehow made the situation feel even more serious. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had never heard from him before. He said the situation was no longer just a family dispute. If the documents were forged and money had been exchanged to cover it up, there could be legal consequences far beyond inheritance issues. Investigations, financial audits, possibly even criminal charges depending on what the records revealed. Hearing that should have frightened me. Instead, I felt something strange lift from my chest. For years, my family had controlled the narrative by keeping everything private. Secrets thrive in silence, and they had relied on that silence to protect themselves. But once lawyers, investigators, and public records become involved, secrets start losing their power. And that was the last thing my mother wanted. Later that evening, while reviewing the video again, my phone buzzed with a message from the unknown number that had sent the recording. Only 3 words appeared on the screen. "He knows you saw it." My breath caught instantly. Before I could respond, another message followed. "If you want the truth about your father, you need to meet him before your family finds him first." The message included a location. No explanation. No name. Just an address. I stared at the screen while my heart pounded in my ears. My husband read the message over my shoulder, and the room fell into the kind of silence that changes everything. Because both of us understood the same thing at the same time. The man who had been paid to stay quiet was no longer hiding. And if what he knew connected my father's death, the stolen shares, and my family's desperation to destroy me, then the story of my wedding was never the real story at all. It was just the beginning. The real truth was waiting at that address. And the moment I stepped through that door, there would be no going back.